Hello, future servers. Back here again. Right now I'm with Officer Knetzger of the Green Bay Police Department. Thank you for taking the time, Mike. How long have you been with the force now?
I've been in law enforcement for the past 27 years. I came up to Green Bay in 1997.
So once again, you're getting somebody with a ton of experience in these types of situations, and he is actually specially educated on this stuff. Right now we're dealing with intervening with impairment, but now we're going a little bit further into the police side of things, and he actually teaches a class every year for security and serving alike to help you out in these certain types of situations when you're intervening with impairment, and that's what we're going to kind of get into today. First of all, let's talk about the differences between representation and reputation when you're working for an establishment.
Well, anytime you're hired by an establishment to work as a bartender, or whether it's even a waiter or waitress, whatever position that you're in, you represent that organization. And typically representation is going to be immediately judged by customers based upon the communication skills that are used. So oftentimes when you have a very positive interaction with somebody, that based upon communication skills, that is going to reflect positively on the establishment, the organization, and word is going to spread that when you visit to this bar, this restaurant, when you patronize them, you're going to get good customer service. Because at the end of the day, who doesn't like good customer service? Even in law enforcement, I provide a customer service. I've never had anybody complain about good customer service. So the number one complaint that I take as a patrol sergeant is rudeness. Number one complaint that I take is rudeness. And it's oftentimes based upon perception, and perception is everything. So if the perception based upon the communication skills is positive, people are going to leave your establishment with a very positive perspective of the service that they received. And that can mean, that is priceless. I mean, that's even more valuable than advertising that you pay for.
Absolutely. What I agree with too is that when you're giving good customer service, you're creating an identity for the establishment and for yourself. So if something happens to where you have to intervene with a patron, and somebody's been too intoxicated, and you have to intervene with that, you already have that reputation. So it's not a reputation of this person always is going to act badly to me. Now they know that you're going to do what you can to make sure that they're taken care of, and you've already laid that ground for yourself beforehand. So that's where good customer service is key. Now, we talked about communication and good customer service and being proactive on this situation. Now, what are some methods that you can use for de-escalation? Some simple techniques in case somebody's had too much to drink and you have to deal with that while you're on the other side of the pond.
So one of the key points of de-escalation is that you cannot de-escalate someone else unless you can de-escalate yourself. Every one of us, regardless of my experience in law enforcement, your experience interacting with customers, behind the pine as you call it, is that somebody at some time in our lives has said something to us that has made us mad. And you get that internal feeling that essentially that this person has really made me angry. And once you have that internal feeling, if you cannot de-escalate yourself, you cannot de-escalate an opponent without a struggle. So you first have to de-escalate yourself. So what are some things you can do to de-escalate yourself? And these cost absolutely nothing. The first thing is the power of a deep breath. If you take the power of a deep breath, you actually reset the regions of the logical hemisphere of the brain that allows you to make good logical choices. If the first thing you say is the first thing that readily rises to your lips, it's probably going to be something that's not conducive to the communication environment. So for example, if you quip right back because you think it's hilarious, well, it's probably not conducive. There was a very well-known author of verbal judo. His name is George Thompson. I highly recommend you read his book. Is that he said that if it feels good, no good. And that the most dangerous weapon is a cocked tongue. We all have a master's degree in sarcasm, especially if we're working behive the pine, as you
Very
say.
accurate, yes.
But it's typically not going to be conducive. I also recommend embracing the power of humor. I've never had anybody complain that, wow, that guy made me laugh. I was so frustrated because I laughed so hard. When you make somebody laugh, increases dopamine in the brain, and it's a very positive feeling. Also, don't be afraid to embrace the power of a cigarette. Now, I realize that cigarette smoking cannot happen within your establishment, but I can't tell you the number of clever techniques where a bartender has offered some guy a cigarette, hey, let's go out and have a smoke, and now you've won half the battle. You got him outside your bar.
Yeah.
And maybe you even had a responsible ride that was just happened to be close after you use that technique. And it's very difficult to dislike somebody who gives you something.
Brilliant.
So now once you're able to de-escalate yourself, it's also important to remember that, alcohol is a factor in the environments you work. Let's face it. Their brain might not be ready to receive a logical message. So you can only control what you can control. And at the end of the day, if there's an interaction occurring and there's a third party over here with a camera, and the camera captures your professional interaction, and that person frankly being a jerk, and alcohol is probably a factor, is at the end of the day, let's say police had to be called and that person had to be escorted out, and the bar owner, police, whoever it is, watches that video, that who's going to be the reasonable one? Well, clearly the professional was the server.
Sure.
And at the end of the day, that goes right back to our first point of professional representation.
That's awesome. This is all very, very good information that I hope you guys take with you. Know that if you do offer that cigarette or go outside with the patron, make sure that there's somebody else behind the bar. Anytime you leave behind the bar, you're creating a situation to where there wouldn't be anybody in charge if something were to happen to you. So, but this is all very, very great. Now, we're talking about customer situations and arbitration, and there's a REACT acronym that kind of comes with that. Can you explain that a little bit for us?
Sure, and the acronym comes from some training that law enforcement officers are given. And what REACT essentially means is request cooperation, explain the reason why you're asking for it, allow them to make choices, check their choice, and take action. But instead of having to worry about what that acronym means, it's a lot easier just to understand the process. So let's say, for example, you had to ask somebody to leave your establishment. They became a little disorderly. You received a complaint about behavior that just wasn't acceptable. The first thing you do is simply, when you walk up to them, is always introduce yourself. Even as a responsible server, a manager, whatever your role is, and you represent that business, you bring a little bit of authority with you. What's the authority? You can tell people to leave. That's your establishment and what you represent. But whenever a person of any authority walks up to somebody, they're thinking, why the heck is this guy talking to me? So let's just kind of get that off the table and say, here's why I'm talking to you and here's who I am. Always introduce yourself, especially if you've never met this person before. So introduce yourself, what your role is within the organization, and why you're talking to them. So it could just be simply as, sir, we received a complaint that you've been a little disorderly here, you're using language that this family over here doesn't approve of,
Sure.
and we're going to have to ask you to leave.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if they leave, fantastic, problem solved. But if they don't leave, what are your options? And that is where you provide them with two choices. One choice is positive and one choice is negative.
Yeah.
Now, the negative should never be a threat. And never say things like, well, we can do this the easy way or the hard way, all right?
You're creating
Right,
a situation where they're going to push the button.
Right, and now you're
Yeah.
escalating.
Yeah.
And you are never in the business of escalation, you
Yeah.
are in the business of de-escalation.
Correct.
So the first choice is, sir, we'd just like you to leave for the night.
Mhm.
But the second choice could be something as, sir, the last thing that we want to do is have to call the police. The last thing we want to happen for you is to get cited for disorderly conduct. You've been in my establishment before, you've been a great patron, maybe you're just having a bad night. I'd really like to think you can work with me, and the last thing I want you to do is go to jail.
Exactly.
So when you explain that now, so if they choose the bad option, which is police citation, possibly go to jail, it didn't sound like the hard way.
No, basically you went from like, don't make me have to do this to, please don't let us have to do this. It would create a bad situation for all of us. You talked a little bit earlier before we got on the camera about sprinkling some sugar. It
Right.
sounds like exactly what you did.
Yeah, you always sprinkle some sugar, and then you pause after your two options and allow them to make a choice.
Mhm.
And let's say they still say, I paid for this beer, I'm not leaving.
Sure.
Well, before you take your action or call the police, allow a person to save face,
Yeah.
right? And typically what we say is, and what I advocate you say is, are you sure? And I'd like you to think we can work together.
Yeah. That way you put
Yeah.
your both of yourselves in the same situation, not creating that separation between him and yourself. It's like, hey, we're both in this. How can we both make it out without having to create more conflict?
Right.
So.
And then if they say, no, I'm not leaving, call the police, well, you've now tried your best. I advocate for a hands-off approach.
Sure.
Just because, your job is not worth getting injured over if somebody becomes assaultive or whatnot.
Yeah.
And it's always better, from my law enforcement perspective, if someone has to be removed and they're not being immediately violent, that call law enforcement. Hopefully you have great partnerships with them, and then have them escort the person out.
Correct.
And maybe they stood their ground and the police show up, and they had maybe just a bad case of handcuffitis, and they just didn't want to get handcuffed that night.
Sure.
So then they leave with the police.
I tell you what, when you follow all these tactics, there's a very, very slim chance that the police will show up in the first place. But second of all, if you do grab that phone, 9 times out of 10 that person is going to accept it and walk out because they don't want to deal with that essentially, and neither do you. This is all very, very good stuff, and it's probably one of the more important segments that we're touching on throughout your class today. So lastly, I want to talk about your moral obligation as a server, and I want you to talk about that a little bit and your family history as well.
Sure. So from the moral obligation of a server is, I believe that people who work within a customer service environment, that we typically have three things in common. And this is common across all cultures. And the first thing is that you value your well-being. You value the well-being of those who are closest to you. So that would be the well-being of your family, your restaurant family, your bar family, whatever it is. But you also value the well-being of all people. People who are involved in customer service value all people because they are people. They don't treat them differently because of the color of their skin, their sexual orientation, how much money they make, their religious beliefs. They value all people, and that is a healthy, moral perspective. And it's not a relative value, it is an absolute value.
Correct.
And when you embrace that absolute value, it actually influences your communication skills because you've accepted the value of all people. Because what we typically see is if you don't embrace the idea of self, others, and all others,
Mm-hmm.
you get emotionally impacted by something somebody says. It then becomes evident in the words you use.
Sure.
Because you whip back something emotional, you say something inappropriate, and,
Yeah.
and maybe it's inappropriate. It's not only inappropriate based upon the communication
Yeah.
environment, but it's an inappropriate verbal statement for that environment.
It's important to let things slide when you're in the job you're in, because otherwise, if you let something stick, it's going to create a bad situation.
Well, I always say it's like the water going off a duck's feathers.
Exactly.
Right? Just let it
Yeah.
roll off your back
Yeah.
itself. So that perspective influences your communication skills and the way you treat people. Now, I also want to personally, thank you for choosing to work within the customer service environment. I think you play an important role in, helping people, especially get through the insanity of a Wisconsin winter. But also because through responsible beverage serving, you can prevent tragedy. And I'm here to tell you, as a victim family, we lost an 18-year-old daughter who was killed by a drunk driver. She was killed on June 3rd of 2008, and I was working as a Green Bay police officer the night that she was killed. Her name was Ashley, and I did not go to her crash scene. But later on that night, after I saw a message on our computer screen that said, check out the double fatality in Ashwaubenon, the very first thing that I thought is that a family was going to get a very bad message that night in the form of a death notification. But never did I imagine that that was going to be my family. And no words can describe the pain that we lived with then, and we will still continue to live with the rest of our lives. But through responsible beverage serving, by being that one that prevents them from getting behind the wheel, by taking advantage of rideshare programs that we know are very available to you, by even if you have the staffing available, and I know establishments that have done it, they've taken patrons home themselves to allow cars to be parked in your parking lot so they don't drive. All of those things can prevent the ultimate tragedy. Because trust me, you don't want to knock on the door from me in uniform with another cop when I'm telling you that your loved one is dead. So when you do it well, you can also prevent tragedy. So her name, like I said, her name was Ashley, and if you want to learn more about her, you can go to her website, which is ashleystory.org.
Excellent. Mike, this is very important. Thank you very, very much. I'm sure everybody learned a lot from this.
So
Thank you very, very much.